Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Baker Institute Energy Forum. It's a pleasure to bring today's program. We were imagining in our minds that maybe the program would have to be rescheduled because it could be stormy at the same time of the program, but we've had a very calm season, but we learned a lot of things last year and have a lot of things to discuss today. I'm Amy Jaffe. I am the Wallace Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute, and I'm also the Associate Director of the Rice Energy Program, which is a joint venture with our partners, the Rice Energy and Environmental Systems Institute. And we welcome you here today for this panel discussion. Our format is going to be each of our wonderful speakers has brought a formal presentation, some slides to sort of give us an overview of what we learned from last year's season and what kinds of steps and measures have been put in place since then, and some of the other challenges that might still remain to be discussed. And each of them will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then maybe 25 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion. Let me just say, because we're a small group this afternoon, that maybe we could be a little more informal. If you're, as with the presentation going, I guess if you really see something you want to ask, feel free to raise your hand, but otherwise we'll definitely have a discussion period at the end of the session. So I'd like to introduce right now Gary Marfin from our Energy and Environmental Systems Institute, and he will tell us a little bit about our programs on this topic and introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome again to the Baker Institute here at Rice University. And I want to thank you for coming out. I know it's difficult in Houston to get from point A to point B sometimes. So I'm always impressed when we have a group here that manages to come in what is basically rush hour. We have a very good program, as Amy mentioned this afternoon, on a topic that remains timely. In fact, in Houston, I guess anytime you have a moment of calm, it really is the calm before the storm, because they do come inevitably. Each of these speakers today, if you look down the list, is distinguished, is an expert in their field, and more importantly, they're not just paper experts. They have genuine experience. And I think what they have experience in is in the task of communicating and coordinating across a multiplicity of parties during extreme events like hurricanes. We learn a lot each time we have a hurricane. Today, we're all about trying to find out what it is Hurricane Katrina taught us. So with that in mind, we'll take the speakers in the order in which they are listed. That is Mr. William King, Mr. Kenny Lang, Chris Owens, and then Phil Bedient. Okay? And then if you would just say a few words or give your talk, we'll follow that up with questions once we've heard from all of you. All right? Thank you.
That'd be fine. First of all, this PowerPoint that I'm going to go through is on this website that you see here. So if anybody wants to get on and use any part of this PowerPoint, they're welcome to do it. I stole most of this from somebody else, so you're welcome to take and use it. Stole quite a bit of it from Phil, actually. So this presentation is primarily what I'm using when I go out and talk to people about what they need to be thinking about in terms of getting ready for an evacuation. So I'm going to do sort of an abbreviated version just to sort of highlight some of the issues for you that at least I'm talking about to the public and give you some idea of what's going on out there. This is something I always start with the public. This is a telegram that hangs in the emergency center in Austin. And it's a telegram that was sent, somewhat ironically, on September the 11th, 1900, from the Citizens Committee that had formed to try to establish some kind of civil order in Galveston immediately after the hurricane. This is still the worst natural disaster in U.S. history. There were at least 8,000 people killed, probably quite a few more than that. There's some of the history that indicates that African Americans were not counted in the death toll, and if you added them, you probably end up with more like 10 to 12,000 people who died in the storm. Virtually the entire city was destroyed. And to give you some perspective, this is 3 times the number of people that were killed in the World Trade Center attack in 2001. We haven't seen a storm surge like Katrina in a generation or so, and I think a lot of us have kind of forgotten what storm surges are really like. And so I use these slides to sort of demonstrate to people what it is. This is a before and after shot down here on the bottom. Is that showing up there? Yeah. This is this house before the storm surge takes out the first floor. This is what it looks like afterwards. I recently took a drive down the Mississippi coast almost a year later, and there is mile after mile of these scenes where it looks like God took his hand and just wiped off the first half mile back from the Gulf Coast. The storm surge just literally took it down to the slab in a very large portion. There's kind of a misconception that Katrina was a New Orleans event, and of course it caused a lot of problems there, but the storm brunt really made landfall along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, around Gulfport and some of those communities in that area past Christian. These are some before and after shots that I use just to try to make sure people understand the true enormity of the storm surge. On this side, you notice this palm tree here in both pictures. This is before the storm, and this is after the storm, no house. This apartment project, you see the little sign here. Here's the sign after the storm, no house. These are some more. You notice the same Jaguar in the driveway. This is before the storm. And this old beautiful Nantucket-style house is completely gone after the storm. The state did some modeling. This is actually before Katrina and Rita, when we finally kind of got the governor's attention and started working on this. And they used Hurricane Carla as the model storm. Carla was a Category 4, 175-mile-an-hour winds. What most people have kind of a misconception is that Carla hit Houston. It really didn't. Carla hit down in Matagorda Bay. The maximum storm surge was recorded in Matagorda Bay of about 22 feet. In Galveston Bay, it was only about 15 feet. It really missed us by about 100 miles. And what the state did was they took that storm and modeled it as if it came across Freeport, which is the worst track scenario for us. And these are some slides that just show you what a storm surge of a Category 4 storm would look at. Now, let me make sure you understand these pictures do not in any way depict the worst case. Katrina had a measured surge of 28 feet in some places, and this does not take into account any flooding that would result from upland rainfall that couldn't get out the bayou system. This is just the Gulf of Mexico being shoved on shore. Of course, this shot is out over Galveston, looking back out in the Gulf, looking across Galveston and Texas City, and just kind of step through these quickly. And you can see what happens in a Category 4. This is the Gulf Freeway right here. It's completely underwater from Texas City down, and virtually everything in Galveston, almost everything in Texas City except the area covered by the dike. This is another series of a bird's eye view of the east shore, of the west shore of Galveston Bay. And this is at 22 feet. This again is the Gulf Freeway, so you can see that virtually everything to the east of the Gulf Freeway is flooded. Most of LaPorte, substantial parts of Pasadena, and then there's substantial flooding up Buffalo Bayou here all the way into downtown Houston. This is a shot looking back at the Clear Lake area, and this is Ellington Field right here. If any of you all are familiar with that, you can kind of get some perspective of what happens. Galveston Bay is basically shoved all the way back to Ellington Field. If you say this is a 22 feet, if you add another 6 feet to a 28-foot storm surge, this would cover a much larger area. So this gives you some idea of what we're facing. One of the points that I like to try to make to people is when we're thinking about hurricanes, a lot of times it's kind of like fighting wars. The general's fighting the last war. And to a large degree, our people right now are planning for the last evacuation, which was Rita. In many ways, Rita was not a typical storm. It was a very well-behaved storm from a forecast perspective. It lined up on the Texas coast about 4 or 5 days out. Really, from about Sunday night on, we were looking and worrying about that storm. We had a lot of time to think about it and to get ready and get out of town. That is not typically the case. These forecast tracks have incredible margin of errors, and I want to show you what took place on Katrina, both to demonstrate, number one, how little time you may have to think about these things, but secondly, there's been a lot of criticisms of New Orleans and how ill-prepared they were and what bad decisions they made. And I think both of those things are true, but they were also dealing with an extraordinarily difficult situation. This was the situation about noon on Friday. This white line that you see here, this was the forecast track at 1 p.m. on Friday. This red line is where the storm ultimately went. So if you're an emergency manager sitting in New Orleans having lunch on Friday, you're not even thinking about evacuating your city. I mean, this forecast track is 300 miles to the east of you. You're on the dry side of the storm. I mean, you might see, some balmy winds and a couple of thunderstorms from this storm, but nothing that would make you even think about evacuating. But look what happens. Friday night at 11 p.m., the forecast track is moved directly over New Orleans. Now, if you were going to pick a time of the week that would be the absolute worst time to tell New Orleans they're getting a hurricane, probably middle of the night Friday would be about as bad as you could pick the time. Well, that's when they found out. They wake up Saturday morning and the forecast track is still on them. Now, I got to tell you, to me, where the mistake was made in New Orleans is not calling a mandatory evacuation at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning. I think you've got to call it, and they did not call it. They called for a voluntary evacuation, and were really kind of soft-selling the danger. And during the day, you can see the storm doesn't move very much, and it doesn't intensify very much. All day Saturday, I think it moved less than 100 miles during the entire day. It didn't intensify much. It's only moving at 7 miles an hour. And I think they got lulled into a little sense of complacency that they had more time to deal with this. It might veer off. Maybe it wasn't going to be as bad. But the forecast at this time was for all conditions were for strengthening. And look what happens to them from 10 p.m. Saturday to the next morning at 7 a.m. This storm goes from a Category 3 to a Category 5 storm literally overnight, going from 115-mile-an-hour winds to 165-mile-an-hour winds, at the time one of the strongest storms that had ever been recorded in the Gulf of Mexico. But here's the thing that I really want you to take note of. This thing went from moving at 7 miles an hour to moving at 12 miles an hour, basically cutting what evacuation time they thought they had in half. They finally called the mandatory evacuation about 10 o'clock. This blue line that you see right out here, this was where tropical force winds were at the time that they called the evacuation. You can see it's only about 100 miles away from New Orleans. Typically, you want to have your evacuation completed by the time tropical force winds hit because there's some vehicles that become unstable at those winds. Finally, at 6 o'clock, they get the storm less than 8 hours from when they called mandatory evacuation, a totally inadequate time to evacuate 500,000 people. But if you think back, if they had been absolutely prudent, the first time they would have started moving was the middle of the night Friday. So it was less than 48 hours from the time they were notified, the storm track's on you, until they needed to have everybody out of town. And if you discount the fact that it happened in the middle of the night, they really only had about 30 to 36 hours to respond to this. And I'm telling you, if we had been faced with that situation, we would have not done much better than they did. We think about hurricanes as being relatively uncommon events. They're really not if you look at a long enough historical. This is a track of every storm in the Gulf of Mexico for the last 150 years, and you can see there's hardly a square inch of the coast anywhere that's not been affected. This is a depiction of every storm that's come within 120 nautical miles of the city of Houston, of downtown Houston, within the last 100 years. There's 34 tracks on there, which means that statistically over a 100-year period, we get a storm that's at least going to affect Houston about once every 3 years. What appears to be happening, though, is these storms appear to move in cycles of about 20 or 30 years. And it looks like that you'll have a higher activity for 20 or 30 years, and they kind of dull for 20 or 30 years. And sometime around the mid-1990s, we came out of one of the down cycles. So for most of our adult lives, what we've been accustomed to is not necessarily what the average is. It's been a lower period, and this is demonstrated. You can see how many more severe storms have been in the last decade than in the previous decade. This is another chart that depicts the same information. This starts back in the 40s, and you can see it sort of topped out in the early 50s. Carla would have been right along in here someplace. But for most of our adult lives, we've been in this valley. But look what's happened in the last 10 years. And you extrapolate across and see we're probably right at the peak of this. There's some meteorologists that argue because of global warming, this oscillating curve is actually tilted upward on a positive slope. And so maybe this peak is going to be worse. I think it's important to note that even in the busy times, you have some down years, which is exactly what we're experiencing this year. And one of the things that Bob and I were talking about earlier that I worry about more than anything else is that we don't have a storm for a year or two, and everybody thinks, well, you know, that was a once-in-a-lifetime event. I don't need to worry about that. We get another couple 100,000 people in town that don't know anything about hurricanes, another 50 or 60,000 people in the storm surge areas that don't know anything about hurricanes, and we'll be caught with our guard down again like we were with Rita. This is the mandatory evacuation zones that the state's promulgated. There's about 1 million people that live in these shaded areas. And this is something I'd like to point out. People think about the surge zones only being in Galveston, Missouri County. That's really not true. About 20% of Harris County is in the surge zone, all the way up to this is the loop right here. So you actually have some area over there in like Navigation and Canal and those areas that are subject to a mandatory evacuation order. So this is not just a Galveston County event. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this because some of it's really designed for an audience about talking about them, what they're going to do. Let me tell you what the traffic data showed from Rita. All the work that was done on traffic management before Rita, and I have to tell you that there was you would be shocked at how little work was done on it. But the work that was done was primarily concentrated on how do we get people out of those surge areas to high ground. And nobody really gave a lot of thought to what are we going to do with them after we get them to high ground. And if you look at the data from Transtar and other anecdotal evidence, what it tells us is that the evacuation really broke down on the north and west sides of Houston as people tried to exit the city of Houston. And these were sort of the critical choke points, you know, because of freeway construction and some of these old turning movements that haven't been updated in 20 or 30 years. Basically, right now, as you try to leave Houston on the north and west sides, you only have about 7 freeway lanes to get out on. And it comes down on these choke points. And for example, here on 45, this is right at the San Jacinto River bridges. And if any of you travel out that direction, this is where currently those bridges are under construction, and it goes off onto the feeder street, and it goes from about 5 lanes down to about 2. That's where the evacuation on 45 broke down around the middle of the day on Wednesday and literally backed up all the way through town into Galveston County and was like that for about 36 hours or so before it started clearing up. If you just kind of do a little basic math for a second and say, let's assume that we're going to have 1.5 million people evacuate. There's only about 1 million in the surge zone, but what we've learned is a bunch of people outside the surge zones are going to evacuate, and there's some legitimate reasons for those people to want to evacuate. If you say we're going to have 2 people in every car, and then you say that the average freeway lane, when it's working absolutely perfectly, carries 2,000 cars an hour, well, you figure out that it takes us about 53 hours to clear 1.5 million people on those 7 lanes. Well, New Orleans had about 36 hours to respond to the call for an evacuation. Now, this assumes that that freeway lane is going to be working perfectly, which we know it's not going to be. It also assumes that nobody but evacuees are going to be trying to go through those choke points, which we also know is not going to be the case. So this is the fundamental logistical problem that we have in trying to evacuate a city like Houston. I served on 2 task forces. I served on the governor's task force on evacuation, and then the county judges in this region appointed a local task force, and I chaired that task force. And at the state, we looked at general policy, statewide type issues, and on the regional, we looked at issues specific to this particular area. And we made a bunch of recommendations. Both reports are about 20 or 30 pages. They're on the HGA website if you want to go take a look at them. But they sort of broke down into 4 areas I want to talk to you about for just a second and tell you some of the things that we recommended. let me hasten to add that just because we recommended these, it doesn't mean that these all have been adopted and put in place. It's a lot easier to write them down on a piece of paper than it is to go out and implement this stuff in the field. But this was sort of the blueprint that we laid out. The first problem that we tried to address was the command and control problem. This fundamentally arises from the fact that in Texas we allow, or we mandate, that local jurisdictions manage their own emergencies. So if there's a fire in the city of Houston is responsible. There was a fire in Bel Air is responsible for dealing with that fire. And for the vast majority of emergencies, that works well. If their resources are overwhelmed, they can go out and call for help from neighboring cities or county or even to the state if it's a bad emergency. But a hurricane, by its very nature, is a completely different kind of event. It's going to cover hundreds of square miles and hundreds of jurisdictions, and if we leave everybody in charge, then guess what? Nobody's in charge. And I think we saw that lack of coordination very dramatically in Rita. So we recommended that somebody be put in charge of the evacuation. As you might well imagine, the local officials were not too crazy about that idea since it took away some of their authority. So we went through a fairly lengthy negotiation, and we finally ended up with a command council where 15 people are going to meet at Transtar, and they're going to try to coordinate the activities of all these governmental entities. I have to tell you, that was not my first choice. When I was thinking about this, I was reminded of the old saying about, "For God so loved the world, He did not send a committee." This is one of those situations where I'm not sure we really need a committee. But at least for the first time, we do have everyone agreeing to meet at a place, coordinate their activities, which none of that existed before. They've also agreed to set up a joint information center to issue official communiques about what areas are to be evacuating. So you won't have the mayor of Houston standing up and saying one thing, the mayor of Galveston standing up and saying something else, and Brazoria County judge saying a third thing, hopefully next time. Fueling was a big problem last time. I'll have to tell you that I think this problem has probably been solved. There were surprisingly fairly simple answers to this, it looked like to me, from serving on both task force. The state is working very closely with industry. They've set up a fuel desk, have bought some software so they can track gasoline stocks in the entire area and make sure they get to places along the evacuation route. I think with working with industry, they've probably got that problem pretty well in hand. Again, that was something there was virtually no coordination on before Rita. The big conundrum in evacuation are special needs. We estimated that there are 50 to 75,000 people that live in the surge zone that are unable to evacuate themselves. There is no easy answer to this one, folks. You saw in New Orleans what happened with some people being left behind. The nursing homes are a particularly critical problem. And you're really sort of in a catch-22 when you start dealing with these fragile populations. We met with the nursing homes at great length. I did not talk to a single nursing home who evacuated who did not lose at least one patient in the evacuation. So anytime we call for an evacuation of these kind of populations, we're going to lose some folks. And with the margin of errors on these storms and the number of false alarms we're likely to call, that's a big problem. There's a lot of work being done by this right now with the city of Houston and the state on creating databases to try to identify these people, try to get some idea of the resources that are needed. Ironically, one of the problems is that folks that are in this situation typically don't want to be identified. They don't want people to know who they are. They feel like they're vulnerable, and they don't want to be in a database. They don't trust government, and so they are reluctant to self-report. So the local governments are trying to identify some of those folks and get them in the database. This is going to continue to be a real problem. The traffic management piece, there were really sort of three things that we looked at on this. One was trying to get some help to people along the roads, and then there were two things: incident management, which I like to call safe clear on steroids, because you've got to have those roads clear all the time, and they've got to be clear immediately. So what we recommended was that wreckers be pre-positioned along the freeway route so they could get people off quickly, if there'd be a protocol with what to do with those folks. I don't think any of that's in place yet, and so let's all keep our fingers crossed that we don't have a storm till we can get it in place. It's a bunch of moving pieces to that, but I know that's what the state's working towards. The state has contracted to have some aid stations along the evacuation route, so there's going to be a place where people can get off and get ice, water, some basic medical care, some help with their car, that sort of thing, place to go to the bathroom. The traffic management plan has been very hotly debated and is still being debated. I've actually exchanged some emails with DPS and TxDOT over the weekend about this. I'll just make a couple, three general points about it. One is, prior to Rita, the general theory of evacuation was something that we call directed evacuation, where the DPS and TxDOT basically theory was that they want to take people in particular areas and try to direct them along certain corridors to designated evacuation areas. So, for example, their idea was that everybody in East Galveston County would go up 146 in East Texas. And when you're looking at things on a big macroeconomic or a macro scale, that seems to work. But when you drill down to people's individual situation, it doesn't work worth a damn. For example, I had some friends in Seabrook that had a mother in a nursing home in Pearland, and they had a lake house in Canyon Lake. Well, that's the direction they wanted to go, and they were trying to be forced into East Texas. So they're stopping and arguing with police officers about where they're going to go, which of course ties up traffic that much more. They ended up being forced up to LaPorte, coming back down back down to I-45 and working their way across, creating even more traffic. So both task force recommended to DPS and TxDOT that to the absolute extent possible, let's get away from directed evacuation. Let's concentrate on keeping the roads open and let people go where they want to go, because ultimately they're going to try to do that anyway. By and large, DPS and TxDOT have accepted that general recommendation, but I was having a big fight with them just this weekend because they're still trying to close people's access to cross 45 going westbound. So if they want to go from League City to Friendswood, they weren't going to let them do that. Well, there's a lot of people that have relatives on one side or the other of the freeway, and they need to keep those roads open and let them go. Contraflow has probably been the most frequently discussed issue, and it's something that we have to have as a tool in our toolbox. It is not a silver bullet solution by any stretch of the imagination. Number one, it can only be used on the north and west sides of town. You cannot contraflow through a major city like the city of Houston. It's just physically impossible to control everything. We also need those southbound lanes open for emergency traffic. To give you one brief example, we counted the number of ambulances that we have in the region, and we counted the number of people that are going to need ambulance transportation out of the surge zone. 6 times as many people as we have ambulances. So those ambulances are going to have to make 6 round trips into the surge zone to pick people up. So we've got to keep those southbound lanes open. If we fill them up with northbound cars, it's going to be impossible. To the extent that you're interested, this is the website that DM is posting the most recent traffic information. And I'm telling you, it is literally changing every day right now. But there's a lot of good information about what the current state of their plans are. So if you're interested in a particular freeway, you can look at that. When I'm talking to groups, community groups, especially ones in Houston, I try to help them evaluate whether they ought to evacuate or not. Obviously, the people in the surge zone have to evacuate. To the extent that we can keep people off the road that don't need to evacuate, who are really not in peril, then that will help us reduce the number of cars that have to go through those choke points. There are some very legitimate reasons for people to evacuate. This is a slide I stole from Phil. What Phil did on this was he took a 100-year rainfall event and laid on top of that a 22-foot storm surge, and you can see that the area that's likely to flood is much larger than just the surge areas. So, for example, people over in Bel Air, they've probably got a pretty good reason to want to get out of town, even though they're not in the surge area. Also, this wind cone, you probably can't read those numbers, but the sort of red and orange, those are all winds in excess of 100 miles. It goes all the way up to almost Beltway 8 in the north. There's a lot of folks whose houses are not going to withstand that if you get into some of these neighborhoods. And there's some other houses that probably would withstand it, except they got 500 or 600-foot pine trees all around them. The state gave me a tour of the Rita path from the coast up to Woodville, and I got to tell you, there must be 10 million trees blown down in East Texas. It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. And for the most part over there, they're falling in vacant lots and pastures. But every once in a while, you would go by, we'd fly over and see a house that had been literally cut in half, I mean like a knife going through a cake, by one of these pine trees. So if I lived in Memorial and I had 4 or 5 big pine trees in my yard, I'm telling you, I wouldn't stick around for this event. So we're trying to help people understand what the risk is and make sure that people that are really in harm's way get out. But the ones that don't, they're just going to evacuate because they're going to lose their air conditioning. We're trying to talk them into waiting and leaving after the storm's over, if that's what their concern is. Let's see, I'm going to skip through. This is an important slide. The margin of error, 24-hour forecast, 60 nautical miles. Now, a big hurricane going over Freeport or going 60 miles to the east of Freeport are two completely different events for us. One, we got to get everybody out of town as fast as we can. The other one, we probably need to evacuate it all for. I don't care how big the storm is. If it's 60 or 70 miles over towards Beaumont, the effects can be very minimal on us. And that's at 24 hours. What this means is, because we have to start evacuating out at 48 hours or 60 hours, we're going to have to evacuate a lot of times when we really don't know where the storm is going to go, which means that we're going to be calling a lot of false alarms. And if you look at the numbers statistically, if you call it when you ought to, probably 3 times there are going to be a false alarm for every time we actually have a storm. That has a lot of implications. Number one, people are going to get evacuation fatigue. They're going to start thinking you're calling wolf. But if we're going to be safe, this is just the reality of living on a big, flat coastal plain with a big, elongated coastal shelf out in the Gulf of Mexico. And until forecasting gets much more accurate than it is now, it's a fact of life. This is just some general advice. I'm going to skip through all this. Let me say this. For yourselves or anybody you want, do not for 1 second think that this problem has been solved. I saw that there's a story in the Chronicle this week that said something about they've made all these improvements. We can't evacuate 100,000 people out of downtown Houston every day without causing a big traffic jam. There is no chance that we're going to evacuate 1 million or 2 million people out of the city of Houston without causing massive traffic jams. Anybody that evacuates needs to plan on being in their car for a very long period of time. I guess I'm out of time. Okay. That's the website if y'all want anything this power. Thanks.
Bill, that was great. I'm very glad you represented us on the Governor's Task Force. Our next speaker is Kenny Lang, and Kenny is currently the Vice President, Gulf of Mexico Deepwater Production for British Petroleum. Kenny?
Great, thanks a lot. After hearing that, because most people that are probably here, probably in one form or another, went through a little bit of that last year, and it's great to know that actually people like Bill are deeply involved in making sure it's not quite so traumatic next time around. So that's great to hear that. I've been with BP for about 22 years now, and I've worked. I'm actually a native Houstonian. I think there's one other in the crowd out here, but I was gone for a long, long time. I've worked in Alaska a couple of times, London a couple of times, Aberdeen, and I've now been in Houston since about '99. And I've been in my current role since the middle of 2002. And so we've, had an opportunity to go through Ivan, Rita, and Katrina, and thank goodness this year the gods have smiled on us quite a lot. It's been a lot simpler year for us. The things I'd like to talk about today, it's a big shift of gears from what Bill was speaking about, but there's really 3 things. One is a little bit of an update on the impact to the industry. What really gets publicized, obviously, and rightly so, is all the impacts to people. A big impact to people is also security of supply, and a lot of times it's not always clear about why are the facilities shut in and what's going on, and providing a little bit of insight around that. My simple response is always, before these storms hit the Gulf Coast, they roll over top of all of our facilities. And if you're thinking the people, it's difficult evacuating here, we typically have to evacuate several thousand people each and every time there's a threat, because it does take a long time to evacuate. The second thing is really a glimpse of BP's immediate response following Katrina and Rita last year. And not simply in the sense of what we did with respect to restoring production, understanding what happened to our facilities and things like that, but also there's a big human element of it, because the people who work these facilities for us, they live in the area where it's hit, and so your first sort of port of call you have to go to is about securing their safety and well-being. And then the last thing is there's just an enormous amount of learning that the industry's gone through. A lot of lessons learned that need to be put in place, a lot of technology that we've been able to apply, and so provide a little bit of an understanding of sort of what have we done for, that inevitable next time. Just another picture of, let's see, kind of jump one too many. Another look at the 04-05 storms and the tracks that they took, and I've kind of illuminated where all the leases set out there, and in particular I illuminated where the BP helioses are, where our facilities are located. These are all of our deep water facilities. That's primarily what I look after, as opposed to the shallow water shelf. And without doubt, the 04-05 season was the most devastating this industry's ever seen, and really taxed the industry's ability to deal with it. In fact, it's a multi-year commitment to restore all of and to put back all of the things that were destroyed and upset during that particular period of time. The Helios is there just to kind of guide you a little bit. The deep water is considered anything over about 1,500 feet, and if you look at where Pompano is, which is probably the closest, I don't know if I can use a mouse here, that's sitting in about 1,500 feet of water. This guy right here sitting in 7,000 feet of water. This is about 6,500 feet of water, and all of these are in 5,000 to 6,000 feet of water. And it's just an area where it takes a lot longer to get to people. So there are a lot of false starts where you've got to evacuate people and the storm turned and you got to get them back out again. So logistically, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. I would like to kind of point out, though, but by and large, the deep water facilities, and there's always exceptions, but the deep water facilities, not just ours, but industry-wide, fared really, really well in the face of all of these storms. So they prove that they're very robust and have done quite well through it. There are exceptions. I mean, I'm sure everybody saw pictures of the Mars facility where the rig collapsed on it, and you can see why Katrina, the worst storm out there, effectively rolled right over the Mars TLP. Thunder Horse wasn't out there yet at the time of Ivan, but Nikika was. Got these great photos of the clear eye of the storm, and you can actually see through the satellite the Nikika facility sitting through there. And some of our shelf facilities clocked over 175-mile-an-hour winds. The thing that you might ask, though, is, if all these facilities did so well, how come we knocked out all this production? And I'll come on to that in just one moment. If you kind of look at what actually did happen on the production front, Gulf of Mexico produces about, this is in barrels of oil equivalent, so this is gas plus oil production. Pre-storms, pre-Ivan, produced about 3.75 million barrels a day. Post-Ivan, you can see that it was knocked out, a little over about 1 million barrels per day. Katrina, that was taken down to about a 60% reduction. And since Rita was just on the backside of Katrina, we were taken down to effectively 20% of normal levels, but it's worth saying 100% of the oil production was shut in at that point in time. A very, very substantial amount of the domestic production was shut in post Rita. And even today, there were about 9% remain shut in. This is primarily in the shallow water regions where the facilities are much, much older. Many were toppled and are still, it's a multi-year campaign to deal with it. In fact, we have our own woes. There was about, I think, 115 shelf facilities that were either toppled or are leaning, severely leaning. Out of that 115, we have about 15 that fell into that category. So far this year, we've spent about near enough $100 million, I think it's $95 million, on decommissioning these facilities. We're probably on track for spending as much as $200 million before the year's out. And we've still got probably a year or two to go to get that completely cleared up. And periodically, there's oil that kind of bubbles up from these things. It's actually pretty modest volumes. We actually had, I think it was last weekend, one of our facilities in Grand Isle, one that's particularly tricky, where the facility didn't actually lean over and then eventually fall over where it exposed the wells. It pretty much just collapsed on top of the well stock. And so getting to it is a pretty engineering intensive effort, because what you don't want to do is just go down and manhandle it and find out you've actually made the problem a lot worse than you had before. So I think in that particular instance last weekend, there's about a 25-barrel burp out of one of the wells. There's only one well that's able to flow. It was immediately found out, cleaned up. We've got 24-hour spill response on top of it. We actually met with the MMS and Coast Guard Monday this week, yesterday. Went through our plans, and we're very much aligned on how we want to move that forward. But kind of going to, well, why did the production get shut in? Why was there so much production shut in? This is a storm track over what we call the Eastern Corridor. And what I've illuminated on the picture is predominantly, because it's an area for us that's a very prolific area. It's where a lot of our production comes from. And so at the end of each of those helios, those are the names of the fields that are out there: Thunder Horse, Nakika, Horn Mountain, Marlin King, Nile, along with a few pipelines. The thing that really jumps off the page at you, if you look at it, there's just a snarl of pipelines all throughout this area. And Katrina rolled right over top of all of that. And if I could back up just a moment, with Ivan, the issue, if you look at this, it's illuminated here, called mud flow areas. We actually had some underwater mud flows so the facilities fared really well through Ivan. Ivan didn't destroy much of the onshore pipelines and refineries and take them out, but it did devastate a lot of the underwater, shallow water pipelines. Lots of them were broken. And of course, you can't get production for a pipeline-oriented region, and you can have all of this capacity sitting out here 150 miles offshore. If you don't have a pipeline you can put it in, we're going to be starving the refineries for production, and that was certainly the case with Ivan. The thing that I would say that's incredibly, I just think powerful, is how the industry, the regulators, the service companies pull together in situations like this. Everybody, there's a dash to secure vessels, to secure diving capacity and all the equipment necessary to effect repairs. There's never enough to go around. And what we found is you could call someone up and say, look, here's the situation I've got in my area. If it was worse than what these guys had, they would turn the vessel over to you and just say, get it back when you can. And there was a lot of instances where we actually worked hugely collaboratively together. The MMS and Chris and his team were very, very helpful in terms of helping us through the regulatory snarl that inevitably can possibly rise its head. Just thinking a little bit about people. This is again a track of the storm from last year. Each one of these little orange houses is either a house of one of our workers or a neighborhood where they're located. And these are the same people who immediately after the storm goes by, we need them to get on a helicopter and go offshore and figure out, is everything okay on the facility? Let's see if we can't get it started back. That is not the first thing on their minds. First thing on their mind is, is my family okay? Is extended family okay? And so what we put together was a humanitarian assistance, big humanitarian assistance effort to go out and ensure the health and safety of these folks, identify and respond to their immediate needs, and help them to recover, and kind of give them the space and the time to do that. Because our view is the more we can take that off of their plate, the more willing they are going to be able to suspend that for a while and come offshore and help us restore production. This is just a quick summary of what we went through in our humanitarian assistance effort. You know, in Katrina, there was about 1,000 employees in the affected area. There were 8,000 employees since it barreled over Houston in the affected areas. We got something between 600 and 1,000 calls for assistance, depending upon the storms. And it was all the way from housing, you know, I've lost my house. My family's, I'm okay, but my mother's lost their home. Could you do something about that? Providing supplies. We set up depots. We had depots staged all across Louisiana and Mississippi to provide fuel, water, food. We handed out 1,000 generators to people to help them sort of get on their feet, Walmart certificates and everything that you can imagine. And post the storm, when you got with our offshore workers and said, what do you really remember about, you know, all the things that happened at the facilities, pipelines, and so on, nobody brings that up. Everybody talks about this. You know, this is actually what they remember is how they were treated. The back to the oil here. That one of the things we did, it was the first ever in the Gulf of Mexico, was, okay, the pipelines are broken. What can you do to actually secure production? And it's never been done in the Gulf of Mexico before. And that is offshore tankering, because we have a vast array of pipelines in the Gulf of Mexico. We rely upon them as a way of evacuating our facilities. You know, there's a ready-made market right there along the Gulf Coast with refining, so it makes a lot of sense. No one had ever done this before, and it requires a dynamically positioned tanker. There's not one that exists in the United States. We don't need them over here. So you have to go and get a foreign flag vessel, which means you got to get a Jones Act waiver, go along to Washington, and, you know, to sort of toot Chris's horn for a minute, I got personal calls from the Secretary of the Interior asking, A, when are you going to get your production on? But B, saying, what can we do to help? And we said, look, we need to secure a tanker to try this out. We've not done it before, don't know how long it's going to take, but to the extent you can help kind of cut through some red tape. They did a phenomenal job for us, and we designed, procured, installed, and had this operating in 61 days, which allowed us to produce 50,000 barrels of production a day, which would not have flown otherwise. So there's a huge amount of cooperation to make this happen. In terms of kind of like, okay, well, what are you kind of doing for the next storm that might be coming through here or will be coming through here? It's just a matter of when. We actually started this just after Ivan, and it's been a continuing effort. But really, three things are what I'd kind of like to talk about. One's creating real-time information. Something that a lot of people don't have a deep appreciation for is we evacuate these facilities. We do not leave people offshore during Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. It's just not safe. Oftentimes, you lose power, you lose communication, and you don't know whether it's still there or not until you get on board a helicopter with some GPS coordinates and see if the facility's still there or not. So creating real-time information capabilities, first one. The second one is, how do we quickly maintain and restore production? The third one's about how do we make sure we can maintain real business continuity. This is just a summary, sort of a little montage of four things that we're doing. The first one up in the upper left-hand corner is what we call a hurricane management system. And a lot of this is about bringing lots of information together and integrating it. And what that's a picture of, that's a satellite photo up there of our Thunder Horse facility. And we've done a contract with one of the major satellite providers. And what they do is actually the same guys who work with the Department of Defense, and we do before and after photos of our facilities and then process that to see, is it in the same orientation? Is there any immediate damage? Can we tell if the heliport, the helideck is still stable? And you can begin doing early assessment. So even before we've been able to go back out and check on the facilities, we've got an idea of its basic health. You can't tell down here, but at the bottom of that screen, We also keep up with who's out there, who was out there, who would normally reboard the facility, where do they live, and everything about that facility, so that when we bring it together, we have a good, clear understanding of how to respond in a really robust way. Just to the right of that, you see a long fiber optics loop. There's no fiber optics in the Gulf of Mexico. And what we're going to be installing, in fact, we're in the process of doing it now, is the first ever fiber optic loop that will go all the way from the Freeport area, all the way through all of the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico and land in Pascagoula, Mississippi. It's a $100 million investment. It will allow us, you don't have to rely on satellites and microwave. The fiber doesn't know there's a storm raging, and we can have great real-time information coming back from these facilities. Not just during storms, but it's going to open up all sorts of possibilities around automation and advanced control, because the best way to keep people safe is actually not have quite so many out there at any one time. To not sort of labor on each one of these. The other piece, though, I think is very interesting is the riser monitoring, and maybe it's a little bit of a technical complexity here, but one thing that makes our facilities unique is they all float. And then there's pipe that goes from the facility all the way down to the seabed, and they're referred to as risers. These risers now are continually flexing and moving. That's steel that's flexing and moving, and what you what you care about is the fatigue life. You design it with a big safety factor of margin, but this is blazing all new trails for the industry. Everything we're doing as we move to deeper and deeper water environments, higher pressures, higher temperatures, there's not a lot of books written on this subject, and so the industry's having to kind of create as we go forward. The thing that you want to know is are things behaving as you intended them to behave? And the only way you really know that is having a high degree of instrumentation up and down these risers, and then analyzing that to say, are my designs robust? And then feed that back into the design loop. And we're monitoring and instrumenting all of our deepwater risers. The last one is an invention by us that's called independent remote monitoring. And in the worst scenario, in the worst storms, you do lose power for a protracted period. And what we want to be able to do, last year we all evacuated. In fact, a lot of the earth stations that the industry relied upon are based in New Orleans. They were all knocked out. So we just completely lost communications. What this does, it's a facility that's completely independent of it's about the size of about 2 of these podiums right here. It keeps up with vessel motions, meteorological information, and it's robust to about a 200-mile-an-hour storm. And it sends it, as soon as the storm passes, it sends it over the internet to us. So anywhere we are, it'll tell us the basic health of our facilities. We've now installed this on every deepwater facility that we have. The other big area for pipelines, and again, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but if you, one of the issues is, if one pipeline system gets taken out, are you completely dependent upon just that pipeline system, or can you reroute your production to something that's not broken? So what we've been doing is looking at creating what we refer to as flow assurance. And that is through putting interconnects in, jumpers between pipeline systems. So if you look over here, all of the Southern Green Canyon production normally goes over to the Texas City area. If that for one reason or another is taken out, we can now divert all of our production over to the New Orleans area and vice versa. And so on each one of our major hub areas, we've put that in place. The other thing we've done, and you can't really see it on this slide particularly well, is every one of these facilities over in the eastern area where we had such a problem last time, we've designed the ability to do offshore loading. So we've designed the facility, bought the materials, and we're now in a place to where anytime any one of those facilities loses production, it looks like it's going to be for a protracted period, we can go ahead and initiate offshore loading in that facility. So we pre-engineered that outcome for it. One of the other things that happened in the industry was a number of the rigs. I'm sure you heard about it in the papers. A lot of you guys here, reporters, you probably wrote about it. Of some of the drilling rigs that broke free of their moorings and kind of went running around the Gulf of Mexico. One of the things that, working very closely with the regulators, we've agreed to do is across the piece upgrade all of these to what's referred to as a 12-point mooring, which substantially increases these rigs' ability to withstand severe weather. And we have done that with all of we have one moored rig out there. All the rest of them are dynamically positioned. But the industry across the piece is doing this now. I'm just going to skip this because I think this is pretty BP-esque. You may find not particularly limiting. The other thing that we did last year, and I think we're the only ones that have this capability outside the U.S. Coast Guard, is put in our own search and rescue capability. That in the event that somebody, for one reason or another, gets stranded on a facility, we have the ability to now have a robust helicopter system and pilots that are trained to go out and to conduct rescue operations, independent of the Coast Guard. We actually loaned this out to Shell last year during the storms, and were able to rescue about 40 people off of one of their rigs. So the last thing, and I think I was given a 5-minute warning, I may have a lunar landing here, is at the end of the day, it has been a good year. You don't even want to talk about it too much, but the conditions are such that we haven't had major storms. I think the point that Bill made earlier, though, it's not about if we will have them in the future. And it's all about having a great defense and planning that you can respond in a much classier way than we have in the past through learning. So that concludes my talk.
Thanks, guys, so much. That was very insightful. Our next speaker is Chris Owens. He's regional director of the Gulf of Mexico region for the Minerals Management Service. And his area covers 5 Gulf states, which means he manages a team of 550 people, and he has regulatory oversight on 4,000 platforms. So it'll be great to hear what he has to say.
First thing I'm going to do is get some water. I don't know about anybody else, but it's getting dry. Well, thank you for this opportunity to talk with you. And the 4,000 structures, just to sort of clarify that for those of you who are maybe not quite as familiar, most of them are, a high percentage of them are small single well caissons. Therefore, they're not the large structures that Kenny was mentioning earlier, like Thunder Horse and Pompano and Nakika, that kind of thing. Although probably 1,700 of the 4,000 are manned, and probably 900 you might call at least major in one sense of the word, not necessarily all like the facilities he mentioned, however. And certainly most of them are in the shallow water. Only recently have we moved into the deeper water. Maybe before I get to the first slide, let me tell you a little bit about MMS. We're a pretty small agency. We are part of the Department of Interior, so of course our compatriots are more well known, the Geological Survey, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, to name a few. MMS's largest area of operations, of course, is in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the region that I direct. And we already mentioned the number of employees. We got hit in part by Katrina. Our regional office, which has the bulk of our employees, is in New Orleans, the New Orleans area. It's actually in Jefferson Parish, for those of you who are familiar with the New Orleans area, a suburb, if you will, of Orleans Parish. And but we got hit pretty good as well. Our building was damaged, and we had 150 of our people over here in Houston for 7 months, myself included. So we certainly went through all the ravages of trying to deal with the hurricane impact, both on a professional level, a regulatory level, as well as a personal level. Okay. I'm going to immediately start with sort of some observations, if you will, some of the conclusions, but at the same time try to lead you through some of the same things. I think our first speaker had a lot of things that I'm going to parallel, if you will. And the 2005 hurricane season, I think one of the things that people tend to forget, and one thing I would like to emphasize because it has a lot to do with our regulatory role and with industry's response, consisted of quite a few hurricanes. Obviously, Katrina and Rita and Ivan the year before were of much big note. But as you can see, we had Hurricane Dennis, we had Hurricane Cindy, we had Wilma, we had Emily, and then there were several tropical storms like Arlene and Brett that also impacted things. And when you look at the tract of all those, again, you can see the entire Gulf of Mexico is, again, as our first speaker noted, is impacted by all of that. One of the things that that has as an implication is that those multiple hurricanes provide lots of additional challenges, like on the evacuation, but also raise structural engineering questions on fatigue life of the structures. Even with a minor storm, it's causing fatigue on the structure, on the risers, all the types of equipment that are out there. Certainly if it's closer by, like Katrina and Rita were, there was some overlap in that, cause a great deal of stress on the facilities. So the paths and the strengths of the hurricanes, as our first speaker noted, are not fully predictable. And that is another major point that is it's an inescapable fact of how all contingency planning has to be approached. And if you will, I had a similar slide on Katrina. Our first speaker gave it much more and better attention than I could ever give it. But if you will, some of the same points. You can see on the point G, it came out as a Category 2. At H, it went to a 3, I to a 4, and J to a 5. And at that point is when the full fury, if you will, was being noticed. I also appreciated the first speaker's slide of that the original track as it came out as a 2, leaving the Keys and Florida Peninsula, was that the more likely track was straight up Pensacola area, and only on the east side was New Orleans. So it was going to get the lesser hit from the eye of the storm. So again, that path, that predictability, and all the evacuation kinds of things that you mentioned are very, very important, but also in terms of the industry's planning and how MMS approaches this are similarly impacted. Obviously, all the public felt shut-in amounts of production that was offline were very, very significant. And if you will, they've been significant for several storms. So as an example, as Kenny mentioned, when we had Katrina, we had virtually on the yellow 100% of the oil was shut in. In Katrina, it rose again in Rita to 100% of the oil, and then we had a blip back up again when Wilma came into Florida. There were some precautionary shut-ins because it was, again, a very unpredictable path as to where exactly is it going to go, exactly what kind of strength are we talking about. And so you can see the ramp-up of both oil and gas shut-in of the Gulf of Mexico production on a percentage basis. The other thing that gets lost, however, is the cumulative amount of shut-in. This is a new slide that I haven't used before, and you can see in Hurricane Lily back in 2002, the total amount of production for the entire consequence that MMS tracked was about 14 million barrels of oil, 89 billion cubic feet of gas. Ivan, considerably longer period of time, 44 million barrels of oil, 172 billion cubic feet of gas from August through February of 2005. And then Hurricane Dennis, a few days in July, you can see the numbers. And then Katrina and Rita combined, and actually, if you will, Wilma as well. Through June 19th, the total cumulative production shut-in was 166 million barrels of oil and 800 billion cubic feet of gas. That is an awful lot of production. And that's stating the obvious in the sense that it was felt at the pump. It affected the price tenor throughout the country for many, many months. But those kinds of numbers need to be thought through by policymakers as to, well, what's really at stake. And Kenny gave a perfect example of that, of thinking about, well, can we alternately plan pipeline routings, tie-ins, and even tankering alternatives to try to deal with that. The other thing was, another thing is Hurricane Rita and Katrina in terms of the path, and this gets back to the fatigue argument. All of the little black dots that you see there, and obviously you can't see them very well, are the 4,000, actually I would call them structures as opposed to platforms. Many of them are not really a platform where you can land a helicopter or anything like that. They're a single well caisson. But all of those 4,000 or so structures, which now, by the way, is down to 3,900 because we lost 100 of them through those last two hurricanes, were heavily impacted by the paths of those two storms. The colored area shows the hurricane force winds from the two storms, and you can see a high percentage of all the 4,000 structures. We estimated that about 3,000 of the 4,000 structures were subjected to the hurricane force winds through the path of those two storms. So a lot of damage assessment, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, is still ongoing when you start dealing with all those thousands and thousands of structures. That's just a reminder that, of course, a lot of the impact was in the coastal area. This happened to be in Cameron, Louisiana, giving you some idea. And as Kenny mentioned, the other thing that popped up from the Hurricane Katrina and Rita, which we had not seen in previous hurricanes, was the damage to the onshore terminals. So here you had the perfect trifecta. Even if you had a production facility, a structure out in the Gulf that could produce, and even if you had a pipeline that could get it to shore, maybe there wasn't a terminal that was able to take it, which of course caused even more trouble. And of course, if you had one of the three down, you were still out of business, but you might have had all three down, which means all three have to be repaired in order to get the production back, which was one of the mammoth things that was going on in these last two hurricanes. The types of damage that we talked about and was alluded to a little bit earlier. There was obviously a lot of platforms destroyed, about 115, 113, extensions damage to about 52. And those numbers are subject to change. The platform age is one thing MMS is paying a lot of attention to, and I might add a lot of the industry experts as well, focusing on, as an example, if you had 22 platforms that were less than 10 years old that were destroyed, those were presumably designed with more robust standards. Why did we lose 22 facilities that were only designed in the last 10 years? So those have implications for a lot of more technical research. Let's just give you some examples of the top of platforms, the before and after. The before on the left is before Rita. This happens to be Devon Energy, and you can see the platform is missing. This is BT Operating Company. You can see the top is gone. Chevron's Typhoon, which was lost its anchoring system, its mooring system, turned upside down and moved, I don't know, 50 miles, something on that order, before it was finally found. And the damage assessment continues. This is one of the things that the public really does not understand and has to be kept reminded over and over. It's never a speech that I give that I don't try to remember to mention this, that the underwater inspections of all of those 3,000 facilities is still underway and probably will be underway for a considerable amount of time. There just aren't enough divers and boats to get out and do all that work. I mentioned to one of the fellows here a little earlier, by antidote, I heard that all of the divers that Canada had moved down to the Gulf of Mexico for many, many, many months because they needed more divers. And I'm sure we pulled them in from other places as well, from around the world. But even then, 3,000 structures that need underwater damage assessments of some kind is a big task. So they're not done yet. Lost rigs, Kenny mentioned. Here you see a couple of examples. The other thing is unusual effects on pipelines is another area that MMS is only now starting to inquire more and working with the companies. We had an example in Ivan where one pipeline moved 3,000 feet. Why did it move? And it was only stopped because it ran up against a production platform. Otherwise, it probably would still be moving. In Hurricane Rita, one pipeline moved over 5,000 feet. Both of these occurred not in a mudslide area. So again, huge amount of hurricane forces are playing on these pipelines, and the design implications, anchoring implications, all kinds of engineering implications that are being raised by this that we are only beginning to maybe even ask the right questions, let alone get to the answers on right now. The jackup losses, which were the floating rigs that were turned loose that Kenny mentioned, basically not only the moored ones, but the jackup drilling rigs had problems of being pushed around all over the Gulf of Mexico. The cause was wave inundation and foundation failures. So then what can be done? You can try dealing with their air gap standards, having more space between the where the hull is and where the normal ocean would be, and that space gives you space for the hurricane storm surge and waves to come through. Site assessment of where the jackup is, what kind of geological, geotechnical material is the jackup rig in. Improved preloading testing and transponders are all possibilities. With the moored semi-submersibles, Kenny mentioned this, increase the number of lines, going to 12-point mooring systems, upgrade the wire and chain. These are things that can be done, and many of these are already being done. There's millions, hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on semi-submersibles now. Some of them are just starting to come out of the yard with the fixes on these. But here's a number of areas that are being pursued. MMS has adopted several new requirements in this. We picked up off of the new API standards. We worked carefully with the API committee that formulated 95F and J, which deals with semi-submersibles and jackups, and issued our regulatory guidance, what we call Notice to Lessees, NTLs, and basically requires a site-specific assessment. If you're in a more likely prone area for hurricane paths, and you are going to be looking at, as an example in the case of jackup rigs, you're going to be looking at the soil stability of where you're putting this thing down. You're going to be looking at that kind of scientific assessment of, okay, what kind of site-specific assessment can we make of this as to whether or not this is a proper location. MMS has, in implementing this for the last several months, come up with several examples where we have mutually agreed with the company to come up with an adjustment. Either they've got a new rig or they moved to a different site. And 2 or 3 instances where MMS has just flat out denied, you cannot use this rig to drill this well in this location, and you have to come up with something else, like wait, or else go get a new rig, a different rig that would meet the criteria, the risk assessment criteria that's involved in these regulatory approaches. We're also taking a hard look at platform design standards to look at, as an example, the deck height. API has formal committees underway working on this, and we're working closely with them. This also gets into questions like on fatigue life. That's probably one of the areas that we'll be starting to hear more and more about. There's a conference that API and MMS is a co-sponsor of, planned for November, where fatigue questions are going to be looked at, among many others, probably for the first sort of systematic time. So in conclusion, and some of these conclusions I haven't necessarily covered, I apologize for that, but obviously multiple hurricanes have impacted production to a significant degree. The cumulative production is certainly a take-home point. The design of the Deepwater facilities appears, however, very adequate, as Kenny mentioned. We saw in the case of, with probably the sole exception of Chevron's Typhoon facility, all of the Deepwater facilities have not had a mooring system or a floating system failure. It has been a topsides problem. Topsides can be repaired, and maybe at great expense and great time, but topsides can be repaired. So that's not a catastrophic failure in the broad sense of the term. If the entire system, the floating system, was destroyed, that would be something else. We have not seen that. And Typhoon's question is probably starting to be focused more that there was a problem with the pilings, and the fasteners to those pilings is probably the more likely culprit. The fatigue life of deep facilities probably is going to need to be re-examined with all of these storms, and of course, knock on wood that this year is giving us a respite. The other thing is that even though there were 115 structures, remember there were 4,000 structures, so only a real small percentage, about 2.5, I think it is the calculation, of them were really lost in this multiple hurricane, which was certainly the hardest 1-2 that we could probably imagine. The hurricane caused oil spills, was pretty minimal. There was, however, I'm talking now from OCS production, offshore oil production, there was, of course, this problem of the landfall, and terminals had big problems. There was the Murphy oil spill over in the New Orleans area was certainly a very, very significant one. But in terms of all of the OCS production, all of the offshore production, was something in the order of 17,000 barrels, give or take. MMS just put that up on its website here a few days ago. And of course, the cause of that pipeline movement certainly needs to be examined. So fortunately, I stand as the third speaker, so I was able to paraphrase off the other two real nicely, and hopefully it still made some sense. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our next speaker is one of the hometown boys. Dr. Phil Bedient is a Herman Professor here at Rice University in the engineering, is Herman Brown Professor of Engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He quite literally wrote the book on floods. So, Phil?
10 till 6. Wow, that's tough. It's tough duty. I appreciate the invite to come over and speak before you. My talk will be a little bit different than you've heard. I will be addressing more urban flooding and coastal flooding, and in particular I'll concentrate on impacts on a couple of very critical facilities to the city of Houston. One is the Texas Medical Center, where we have a lot of experience, but again, sort of as a typical major facility, and then also to the main City of Houston water supply plant, which is something else we're also involved in. Advancing slides is just hitting this down here, yes? Yes. Okay, so in the Houston area, major causes of urban flooding, pretty well known to those of you that live in the area. We're highly developed. If you may or may not know, we have the greatest intensity and longest duration rainfalls anywhere on the U.S. Mainland. Very flat topography and little storage, combined with sort of increasing drainage density. And by that I mean not so much the impervious surface, it's actually the drainage density, the channels that move that water quickly to the bayous. The impervious surface has a bit of an impact, but compared to clay soils, it's relatively minor compared to increase in drainage density. And the flood control methods that we've attempted to sort of replace storage with local and regional level detention ponds is in place, but it's always a catch-up game with the rapid pace of urban development. If you don't believe it, just take a spin down the Southwest Freeway, swing around the Beltway, go out to the Grand Parkway, and have a look at where Houston will be in not such a distant future. It's really rather amazing. So what happens in these urban basins is, as we develop these areas, rain falls, and it always looks exactly like that little pattern up there. It comes in exactly a bell-shaped form. There'll be a test on that later. And drops that rain, and then out it comes as a response, as you see down there at the bottom. There's kind of a response. And the response, through time, as you develop a basin, that response in terms of flow rate tends to come out faster and come out higher. And it's the accumulative effect of all of these additional sort of areas of urban development and channels and laterals that feed in that tend to create problems in the lower part of many of the basins in which we live. And so it's that combination of factors that really has caught us somewhat unawares. And it's really difficult to go back in once this problem has been set in motion and turn this around, because many of these developments have taken place over 20 to 30-year time frame. Brays Bayou is one of those areas. I've worked here at Rice and have for many, many years. I used to live out along the bayou, and so I got interested in studying this system as I drove in, and little did I know that after the big flood of 1976, a year after I'd gotten to Rice, that 17 years later we would be greeted with the sort of the most massive urban tropical storm flood of all time, Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, which devastated the medical center, much of downtown Houston, and caused $5 billion in damages. So these are the kinds of areas that we want to try to study. But then if you start to add in to this the coastal issue and the storm surge issue that you've heard about from earlier speakers, it becomes a rather sort of mind-boggling situation. So the problems are well known. These stream flows exceed banks. They tend to spill out with even fairly routine rainfalls. You get a 3 or 4 inch rainfall at rush hour in Houston, and you've set yourself up for a major traffic jam. We need to do a better job designing urban developments to sort of fit in with this internal storage system. And there's some new things coming along, and I'll talk about that as we kind of go along. But the real slide I wanted to point to is this one, where it's kind of like, what are we doing about all of this, all of these problems? And here at the university, we've been fortunate to be able to get involved with a number of sort of new technologies that have sort of hit the marketplace here in the last decade or so. GIS and LIDAR, the ability to do a great topographic survey from an airplane with laser. Radar rainfall estimates and some of the new radars that will be coming in place called CASA radars that we're a part of. Advanced measuring tools for doing a better job with severe weather. And computer models that sort of put all of this together. The next RAD is something that I got personally involved with back in the mid-90s when it was first deployed, and the Texas Medical Center was very concerned about trying to improve their ability to predict floods. They're in a very flood-prone area. So they contacted us, and I got into it in about 96, 97, and we now have about a decade worth of experience with NextRad radar. They work extremely well. We think that they can't ever replace rain gauges, but they do a great job of watching rainfalls approach. They can completely quantify the amount of rain that falls. And if you know the intensity and duration of rain that falls, you can then predict impact. And that's basically how our systems have worked. But in addition to that, we put together, with funding from the medical center and then later from FEMA after Allison, we put together a flood alert system that's a real-time, 24/7 operational system that runs off of a website, fast2.rice.edu. And that system provides a method to estimate peak stream flow at points of critical interest out in a stream. We're doing that right now for the Texas Medical Center. We're getting ready to do that for TxDOT for some of their low water crossing freeways such as 288 and the Katy Freeway. And the idea is this provides frequent information updates via dynamic websites, and these updates are in real time. That's what's different about this system. Now, the other thing about this system is it goes right after critical areas. In other words, we can zoom down to 4 or 5 square mile areas or 100 square mile areas. The National Weather Service does this sort of projection and prediction as well, but they're mainly geared toward county level scale. And so this is a more, if you will, it's a customized type system. Here's a general picture of the way that system works. It even includes quantitative precipitation forecasting, which allows you to take radar estimates and advance them out in time for about an hour to give you sort of an additional hour of lead time on estimation. So we've worked a lot of time and effort, and we've run 30 storms through this system fairly successfully. We predicted on the night of Allison, and of course it seems that on Friday nights at midnight is always when the big storms hit. And so sure enough, it was Friday night at midnight. From midnight to 3 a.m., 14.7 inches of rain fell here on the Rice campus. That's a lot of rain. It also about similar amounts fell in downtown, and the entire 610 loop had something like 12 to 14 inches of rain over it in that time period. Well, we predicted by 12:50, 50 minutes into the storm, that the medical center was going to be in deep trouble, and we told them that at 12:50 a.m. in the morning. We wrote that down in a little logbook. So anyway, to show you how the system looks and sort of how it works, this is a small storm that just came through here a few weeks ago on July 26th. This is kind of what our system shows. Here's a picture of this is the watershed area here. This is the Loop 610, downtown Houston. These patterns kind of move through, and we get an update every 5 minutes, and then this is the prediction that sort of is getting made. This is the future time in color, and this is now time, and then this represents the actual amount of rain that's fallen. So the rainfall is accumulated, and then it's run into a computer model, and as I say, that's kind of how it works. Now, we're working on expanding this out greatly and including what we're going to be calling floodplain libraries in order to map real-time infrastructure and to kind of look more carefully at evacuation routes in the future. We'll also be incorporating storm surge impacts by coupling. We hope to couple inland flood alert systems like this one with coastal storm surge modeling in real time. So the idea is to run these models in real time. Now that's a big undertaking. Turns out these coastal surge models take about 5 hours to run. And they were actually running those through Katrina And later in September, I think it's the September 29th, we're going to have a seminar here at Rice with the storm surge modelers for Katrina during the New Orleans event. And they actually modeled at 15 different points in New Orleans and nailed the elevations plus or minus 4 inches, which is a rather astounding feat, I think, when you consider all of the variables. Our system, we hope to be able to take it. We're not here yet, and this is sort of a mock-up, but the hope is to be able to take the rainfall, make the projection, and then in addition, create a whole series of these mapped databases. So, for example, as the storm moves through, you see how the floodplain increases. And so it's these areas of crossing critical infrastructure and roadways and so on and so forth that are of grave concern to everyone within the city of Houston, not only for transit, but especially for things like movement toward the Texas Medical Center. Okay, switching gears just for a moment, some research that we're involved in. The CASA stands for Collaborative Adaptive Sensing of the Atmosphere. It's an NSF-funded research organization that we're a part of. We are the Houston flood test bed. Oklahoma is the, you guessed it, the tornado test bed. And Puerto Rico is the hurricane test bed. So those are the 3 outreach campuses. We just are now, in fact, next month, deploying the very first one of these radars into the medical center. We will bring these in the period of 06 and 07. We'll build off our existing flood alert system, and we'll test some new models on this, and we hope to expand this out, and we have some interest from other groups as well. Eventually, we hope to have 3 to 5 of these smaller radars sort of sitting within the main flood-prone areas of the city, reaching all the way down to the ship channel, as a backup to NextRad radar, and also to provide more accurate results. These provide pixels the size of 2 football fields. NextRad provides a pixel about 1 kilometer on a side. So we're hoping that this can improve accuracy of weather prediction. They're doing this in Oklahoma because they think for the first time they'll be able to do a much better job of forecasting tornadoes than we have ever done in our history. So it's a big $20 million research center, and there's a lot going on there. So we're kind of lucky to be involved with it. So here's the medical center. It's a city, really almost like downtown Houston in a lot of ways. And it's Smith Tower right here, and on top of Smith Tower is where we're going to put this radar. And it's a radar device that sort of looks something like this. And it'll sit up there and look out over Harris Gully, which actually looks out into this direction toward the Galleria. As part of all of this, we want to then, because this is really a rather complex problem that we're trying to address here. So it's got to be a multi-university, multi-organizational effort. So we want to bring together a Center for Storm Prediction, Warning, and Evacuation. There are 3 funded centers in the United States to address earthquakes. There are no funded centers in the United States to address this problem, all the way through from severe storm prediction, models, website delivery, alert networks, delivering that information to emergency centers, and then making the educated decision about sheltering in place or improving evacuation plans. That's the idea. We have not only hardcore meteorologists and other engineers and hydrologists and scientists, but also social scientists and emergency managers and planners. And we're doing this in concert with private firms as well as the Houston-Galveston Area Council. So that's our proposal. Please step up to the plate here and feel free to get involved with us. We're looking for that. But this Partnership for Innovation, and this is a proposal that's going out, it will develop the infrastructure to coordinate research programs at these universities, work with private sector, deliver innovative technologies in a timely manner, blah, 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 blah. But how do we get this to really work? And the only way we do that is to put together a team of true experts, and that's what we're trying to do, and create this center of excellence. The partnership will do all of these things. It will do the modeling. It will link the models with the radar-based flood system. It will apply these designs and provide input to emergency transportation and evacuation systems. It will also help develop a disaster-trained workforce, educational programs through the University of Houston that link partners to private companies through HGAC. And finally, later, we will deploy a regional forecast testbed down the coast, probably to Brownsville as a second location. There are all the members, lots of universities. You can see we've got representation from Texas, from U of H, from Texas Southern, from UT at Brownsville, and we brought in LSU because of their ability to do hurricane and real-time storm surge prediction. They're the only ones in the country that are fully operational with that right now in place. This is what we want to, these pictures, and you've seen lots of them. It's astounding when you go see this. I've been to New Orleans twice. I went over in November. I went again 6 months later. And the delta, the change that I saw was that they were only building levees. All of the houses looked identically the same as they did 6 or 8 months before. And so it's truly an amazing devastation, and it's something that we definitely want to. In other words, in terms of Rita, you saw this on the afternoon of, I think, the 21st of September. Rita was squarely aimed at us, and it was a rather scary proposition. In fact, we were on this campus at a speech, and the mayor was here, and there was very grave cause for concern. And I think calling for that evacuation was the correct thing to do. We really, I mean, it's a scary scene, especially given that Katrina had just hit a month earlier. But this is the type of information that comes out of those computer models from LSU. This is actually what was being delivered to my email at home. I was getting this every 6 hours, and it's a frightful scene. And every time it would sort of shift a little bit or move around, and it's a function of as the hurricane moves, they're able to make these new projections. But it takes 5 hours to run this on a supercomputer. Well, we ought to be able to improve on that. We ought to be able to do a better job, because this is impacting the lives of literally thousands upon thousands of people. And so it's important that we do this in a conscientious and also in a redundant way, so that this information gets delivered to the people that need to make the decisions. You saw this slide earlier, the one that Bill King stole from me and used in his show. And it is one of my favorite slides, and it's a bit of a scary slide because, as I say, the little circle there is Rice and the Texas Medical Center. And again, he's right. I mean, Bel Air and out in this area, and certainly all of the east side, not to mention what's going on over here in Clear Lake and Clear Creek. And so it's a scary slide. And that's just 15 foot. I'm just showing you the 15-foot storm surge. That's going to happen at some point in Galveston Bay. I mean, that's just not that big of a surge, and it's not that big of a storm. And as the storm surge comes in and as it hits the ship channel, it will tend to magnify. It'll go up as it hits the ship channel. And so here you see it at 22 feet. And so if you go back, let's see, if we zoom in. If we zoom in on that, and we go down and we start looking at these exit routes, I-45 and 288. Yeah, that's the slide that just, it blew me away when I saw it. I didn't believe it. I had the guys go back and triple check it. And then when we did the cross section and we showed the overlay. Now, the only good news about that, there is good news about this slide. All right, the good news is that it's unusual for the storm surge and 100-year 12-inch rainfall to occur sort of simultaneously. But you could imagine that there could be a 6 or 7-inch rainfall that would occur at the same time as the storm surge, given that bands of rain are coming inland. So we showed this to TxDOT, and they said, gosh, let's get together and talk about what we might be able to do for flood alert with respect to. And so we hope to get a project started on looking, initially anyway, at the 288 crossing right here, which is of grave concern, of course, to the Texas Medical Center. Now, let me take you through just some fun GIS graphics. I'm not trying to be a doomsday prophet here, but this was the city of Houston. This is the main water treatment plant, and we had some discussions with them. And again, this is obviously a fairly critical facility, and when it floods, there's all sorts of issues with contamination, and so they have to close it down, and they have to make sure that everything's copacetic. Well, this is a neat little sort of picture of it. Now, you might wonder, why would the main water supply facility for the city of Houston be built right next to the ship channel, but also right sort of it's split in half by a bayou that comes through it? I think it's Hunting Bayou. So as you inundate this with storm surge, you sort of get these pictures that are shown here, and this is kind of the bayou coming back in, and here's one half of it, and here's the other half, and sort of over here. And then it just goes on, and you've seen slides like this. Well, this is our main water treatment plant. So obviously the city has a little bit of interest in doing this. They can switch to other plants, but it's nice for them to be able to know that. And then lastly, I have two slides left. These are two of my brand new favorite slides. This was GIS generated. This is the Texas Medical Center. And if you actually push a button on this crazy thing, you can fly a plane through it. We're not going to do that today, but you can fly a plane down through it. Rather, what I wanted to do is take the medical center and overlay Tropical Storm Allison flooding on top of it. And what we hope to do for some of these critical areas in Houston, what I call the hotspots, is we want to have this on the website and build a library of maps that would then show what Allison looks like when I push the button. Here comes Allison. So there's Allison, and you can see that indeed through much of the medical center. The dark blue represents pretty serious flooding. Now the Rice campus was rather fortunate. You know, this is actually the detention pond where the water is supposed to go. And this is a detention pond on Rice Boulevard where the water just automatically goes. The interesting story about this slide, though, is that the president of Rice University came home that day and wanted desperately to get back to his office over here in the main administration building. And he was dropped off in the village, and he walked along Rice Boulevard in chest-deep water all the way back over here. And fortunately, he didn't fall into Harris Gully, which runs right through here as the main drainage line. Anyway, that's it. That's my last slide. In summary, we think our existing flood alert system has worked well at the regional scale. We think CASA will bring these new radars into place. But we really need to work hard on small basins and evacuation for road inundation. And we think that flood forecasting in the future has got to combine together with storm surge modeling. And this new Center of Excellence, we think, will be a way to be a step in the right direction for that. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm feeling upset because I only live like 2 blocks from the university, but anyway, okay. Let me invite our presenters to come back up to the chairs, and we can take some questions from the audience. Don't be shy. Questions and or comments. No questions?
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
I want to ask a question, if I may, about the command and control issue you mentioned. And I guess in our area we have this command council of 15 people, and I know that wasn't your recommendation as you said, but exactly what rules will be used to govern the deliberation of those 15 people?
Well, it's all pretty informal right now. The 13 people are one from Houston County, and one from the City of Houston, and one from the City of Dallas. And the idea is that they will meet, and that will be the center where calls for I need 6 ambulances or whatever and they'll also sequence the evacuation. There's nothing legally, though, that binds any of those officials to stay on the same page. If the Missouri County judge gets mad and says, to hell with this, I'm walking out, I'm going to do my own thing, there's nothing legally right now that stops that official from doing that. I think it's pretty unlikely because there's going to be a lot of peer pressure to be cooperative, and I think that anybody get pulled out of the joint operations center would look pretty bad in the media. So I don't worry about it happening quite so much practically, but I will tell you that the governor is concerned about it, and they're talking about legislation in this upcoming session that would give all that a little more legal structure than it currently has.
So I have a follow-up question, Bill, for you on something you said too. I can imagine that the industry has, very good distribution, and maybe no one was thinking about it originally for fuel. The thing that concerns me is that all the fuel manufacturing and storage and so forth could, as we've seen from all these maps of storm surge and so forth, and you need, electricity, and you need all these things to pump materials out of tanks. I wonder if, has there been consideration of what would happen if so many of the facilities got damaged in the area where the production is for all of this fuel? Was there any kind of plan or consideration to get fuel that's sort of, say, north of the storm area? Has that been looked at?
Well, we looked at the pretty narrow problem of trying to make sure there's enough fuel in gas stations along the evacuation routes to get people out. All that evacuation needs to take place well in advance of the storm hitting. We typically want to have everybody evacuated before you even get tropical force winds. So you're not going to really have any damage to the supply infrastructure before the storm hits. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about the fact that after the storm moves through, there were a whole lot of gas stations that had gas in the tanks and couldn't get the gas out because of the electricity. And I know at least Valero was looking at going back and rewiring their stations so that they would have a port to walk up and plug in a generator and be able to at least get pumped. But we looked at that pretty narrow problem for the logistics of making sure that the gas was in the ground on the way out. And that to a large extent had to do with inventory control measures. Most gas stations only keep their gas tanks about half full. And so if you just, when you get a storm in the Gulf, you go out and fill up all the gas tanks at all along the evacuation route, takes care of a big part of the problem.
I have a question for Chris about the rig standards. You mentioned a few points, one being that the MMS is looking at requiring 12-point mooring, polyester ropes, improved anchors. Are these techniques that are used elsewhere in the world currently that the MMS has determined or would have been successful had they been employed in either of these two storms?
I don't know if they're required elsewhere. Maybe Kenny does. But the other thing is, to clarify that, MMS would not be making it as a requirement. Many of the companies that are installing this have done this voluntarily, probably as a business necessity, probably also because the oil and gas lessees, operators are insisting that they want equipment that doesn't go all over the Gulf. The other thing is that if there was a regulatory drill, it would be done by the Coast Guard. This would be their area rather than MMS. We have been encouraging this, obviously, and think that this is at least a way to minimize. I'm not sure anyone can categorize it as a total solution. If you have a large hurricane, you're going to have damage, and you're going to have some rigs loose. But in the Katrina and Rita, we had 19 MODUs that were loose. That was totally unacceptable for that kind of number.
Yeah, if I could just add a little bit to it, from a rig owner's perspective, a new fifth generation rig costs somewhere between $300 and $500 million. So it hugely benefits them to sort of know that their rig is going to stay in place. And from an operator's perspective, some of the things that we've done is we simply won't moor one of these rigs near our infrastructure during the storm season. We've just taken the decision not to do that for fear that if it did break free, you could have a collision with facilities. And so we've just taken the decision that we would rather postpone drilling during the hurricane season if we can't actually have confidence that the rig can stay where it is.
There's a possibility that a lot of the pipeline damage was caused by anchors being drawn by these vessels. Is that part of the reasoning for the improved anchoring system, to try and design something that would break away rather than be dragged around the Gulf?
Yeah, well, make sure it doesn't sort of break away to begin with, and then if it does, you want it to fail in a place that doesn't actually result in anchors being dragged. Over in our Nikika field last year, during Ivan, we actually encountered about $20 million worth of damage to the power umbilicals that go out to our wells. And so the scale of the damage can be quite catastrophic. So it behooves everybody to sort of beef up all of these systems and make them far more robust.
To all, could you comment about the effect of global warming with the intensity and the frequency of the hurricanes and the storms we're seeing lately?
We're all looking at each other.
Well, I'm certainly not a meteorologist. I would tell you that just from sitting through a number of presentations on it seems to me that the majority of meteorologists believe that it's having a minimal impact. Most meteorologists think that this, I think they call it the multi-decade cycle or something like this 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, the Atlantic Oscillation, actually, is what they call it, yeah.
And there's a minority of meteorologists that think that oscillation is on a positive slope as a result of global warming, so that every time you get to one of these peaks, it's going to be higher the next time because of global warming.
I would agree with that. I sit on a review panel where I've heard some of the best top climate people in the country talk about this very issue. And generally, and I've heard Neil Frank also, and I kind of agree with some of the things he says, in that we've been in this warm period. And it turns out if you go back and study carefully, 1900 storm was right at the end of one of the really, really warm periods. We're in another one. I don't know, exactly how long it will last, but it doesn't appear that there is we're in a cycle. And that's the general thing.
There's some interesting research being done right now on a guy from U of H is doing these core samples, and they study the isotope levels in the core samples, and they can go back and create a history of hurricane activity over centuries. And that work's not concluded yet, but we might have a lot better idea here in a few years when that research is finished.
I'm a pipeline engineer of long standing, and this idea of one pipeline moving 3,000 feet, another one moving 5,000 feet, and I think of all of the pipelines that come ashore between Houston and Mobile, that's scary. What are you going to do? What can you do about it? What can you learn?
Good question. I think we're only at the beginning of that, and if you will, I think the first thing, as far as I know, and Kenny may be able to add something, is we're trying to work with the companies first on doing a post-mortem of getting much more specifics about what exactly was involved in those pipelines, and just assessing, just other than the fact of the movement itself, what exactly was all the circumstances involved in this, and then as to what steps we could take or should take, that part we haven't gotten.
Yeah, the 3,000, the one that moved 3,000 foot was actually our pipeline.
That's what I thought.
I think it came up to rest against the Chevron facility.
Right.
And I think it took a lot of people by surprise. This particular pipeline had been out there for a long time, had never experienced anything like this. We've actually rerouted it now, actually cut sections out and rerouted it, and anchored it down much more with large concrete pads to hold it in place.
We've used concrete for a long time, and apparently that's not enough.
Well, I think we use more.
I want going deeper.
Yeah. Most of these, once you get out to deeper water, you don't tend to trench and bury so much, or you don't cover them up. You trench it, and then you put concrete pads across it, but they're not fully buried.
Well, I want to thank our presenters today for some really very thorough and interesting and somewhat scary presentations. We feel a little comforted to know that so many of these things are under study. Anyway, we have a few refreshments for those of you who don't have to rush off, can stay and visit with us for a little bit. Thank you very much.